Hey guys, welcome to Signal Path. Today is an interesting day because it is the kind of first day of the rain from what is being described as a hurricane in Southern California. So I thought it'd be fun, since I'm indoors for the day, to kind of give a little bit of a deep dive on what has kind of become the de facto pedalboard. I've gotten a number of questions and just kind of wanted to share a little bit of where my head is at. If you are a kind of guitarist, pedalboard person, I think you probably can relate to kind of the phenomenon that I've experienced this week of building this board and immediately having 9 great ideas that will have to wait for the next one. But I thought I'd kind of share this as what is just kind of my board for what I think is probably through the end of the year, and unless something urgently kind of knocks that off balance. It's been a great board. I've taken it out a couple of times already, and it's served well. It's definitely got a lot of potential. The RJM PVC kind of being sort of a centerpiece, but also this Pandora's box of customization that I've really, I've used in the past, but I've yet to scratch the surface of kind of application for this particular board. So it's a long one, it's kind of a lot to cover, and I kind of just ramble all over the place. But if you like kind of pedals and kind of want to hear about how I'm thinking through what I'm using at the moment for demos here and just kind of music abroad, then you've come to the right place. But yeah, let's get into it. All right, let's take a look at the board as it kind of stands today. I'm playing a Jennings Navigator with humbuckers into the UA Dreamin' Ruby. It sounds a little bit like that. And just real fast to kind of, we'll get into like kind of the bulk of kind of sound samples and how the board is sounding today. But just kind of a little bit of the rationale on what I wanted to build with this board. I really kind of wanted one of each. I wanted, a delay and a reverb and the ability to kind of reinforce that with some extra ambient tools. I wanted kind of EQ and compression at hand and a few different flavors of drive, because this board is really kind of built to be something that I can take on the weekends. I can play out with. I can, pull up useful sounds for demoing things and recording at home and in the studio, as the case may be. But really wanted something that was a little bit locked down, leveraged the mastermind a little bit. That's something that's been missing for a little while from the workflow, so excited to have that kind of back in the fold. But yeah, kind of working really quickly through it. We start kind of with the Bloom and head quickly into the RJM, where we've got the Bog in loop 1, we've got the Iron Horse V2 in loop 2, we've got the green side of the Browne Protein in loop 3, and the blue side in loop 4, Lightspeed in loop 5, and from there we actually leave the RJM for good. We're not using it for a lot of audio switching in this iteration. And then kind of out from here, we head to the Vertex Boost, GFI Synesthesia, to the generation loss in stereo. So the Synesthesia is the stereo split. From generation loss, we end up at kind of the mood in stereo, Hologram Microcosm in stereo, Timeline and Bigsky, and then out to the amps, or amp pedals, as the case is today. But yeah, let's kind of pull up sort of a general use kind of patch that I've been using, and we can kind of work through things. But Ambient is definitely kind of home base. If you've watched the channel for any amount of time, I'm kind of sure you've sort of keyed into that. But let's work through it one by one. So I'm going to leave a little bit of verb on just because I think it makes things nice. So we've got kind of our subtle patch. But that's kind of what things sound like at the moment. One thing I do find with, especially with kind of digital rigs and playing into virtual amps, compression is the biggest kind of difference. And you can kind of get amps to compress kind of a couple of different ways, but definitely by leaving kind of volume low. and not really cooking the preamp, it does seem to have kind of a limiting effect on dynamic range. And you don't get that. As much as I love the Ruby and Dream, they don't really kind of have that overall impact that I'm looking for. So I'm using the Bloom to really do two things. With the compression, I'm looking to, as you can hear, kind of correct for volume. And I'm actually, at the moment, coming in a little bit hot from the Navigator pickups. And so in order to kind of correct for that, I have the volume brought down a little bit. But I do tend to leave compression kind of always on when it comes to digital rigs. I think it just makes things feel a little bit more natural. It's really subtle. In terms of gain reduction, we're really not, taking too much off of the dynamic range, but I find it useful. Because I have the Vertex Boost, I'm really not using the Bloom too much to set level. It is in front of the drives, and so ostensibly could be used to kind of get a different gain character out of things. I'm not using it very much. And I'm really not using the EQ much at the moment, but the one place I do find it pretty useful is taming Telecaster pickups. I do roll off the treble sometimes and leave everything flat. Or if I'm just needing like more mids from something, I will, occasionally bump things up there. Really, kind of solid, not really using it for like, not using it for too much of that stuff, but it does get there if you do change kind of the attack settings. And kind of a future version of this board may tie this into the mastermind in a way that lets me use the second compressor. Frankly haven't really dove too deeply into that. But moving on, kind of next up, we've got the POG 2, kind of by way of the mastermind. And so if we make sure kind of loop 1 is on, we can kind of like roll through. But, usually I would say like the settings that I'm using for this are quite simple. So we'll kick on that preset. Kind of preset 1. Really, really, I would say almost nondescript. And it's worth noting the Lightspeed is on. So gets you like into like 12-string territory if you kind of want, for like kind of ambient passages. Definitely a sound that I've burnt out a little bit on. I would say I think it's something that was very, very popular for a while. It's still a great sound, but not something I use a ton. I use kind of setting 2. A lot more. It's significantly more aggressive, and usually this is going to come on when I've got kind of a couple layers of drive. To kind of almost do like synth lead stuff, but again, generally kind of reserved for really crazy kind of wall of sound octave needs. Heading down, have kind of a few spaces that aren't really in use at the moment. For swells, I've got this kind of setting. It's got the kind of like organ thing going on. It does it pretty well. And then kind of rounding it out. Kind of like a full wet thing for like really subtle stuff, and then another kind of that one always kind of reminds me of kind of cutting my teeth on, first getting into guitar pedals. It reminds me of those old EHX demos. There's kind of lots of those sorts of noises in the mix. But the biggest thing that I'm, kind of moving on from there, the biggest thing that I'm using the RJM for really is to control MIDI for the Bigsky and Timeline, and just setting up kind of template sounds that like get me kind of to an ambient thing really quickly, or to, a specific drive level or sound particularly quickly. Those are kind of like the main reasons that I'm kind of calling on this stuff. And so, to start, actually, let's kind of work backwards in terms of end of the drive chain first, because the Lightspeed, especially with digital rigs, is on almost all of the time. And I would say there's actually kind of a couple demos coming for the Lightspeed and for the Protein, but this is kind of some of the first dedicated sounds that I'm kind of working through with these pedals. From the first time that I plugged in the Lightspeed, though, it was definitely something that it just kind of felt like, without it, it sounds fine. There's some really, really great sounds to be found, but then when you layer it in, it really just kind of brings back that feeling for me of like a clean amp that's working hard, and it reminds me of like the deluxes that I've played. And before I get yelled off the podium, I'm not looking for authenticity. I'm looking for feeling. Like, it's like something that's like, I'm not saying that this is what a exemplary deluxe sounds like, but it makes it easy to play in a way that I really, really appreciate, and I think is kind of honestly rare in terms of how uncolored it is. It just is the sound that I'm playing with, and a little bit louder and a little bit clearer. It has a ton of openness if you really want kind of some nice top end, but I use it kind of, for the most part, really just to add another layer of kind of drag and compression on the signal. But then everything else that I'm using from the Protein and the Iron Horse is going to be kind of layered underneath that. So the Protein Blue, definitely add some nice kind of hair to it. Adds a nice kind of round mid-range to it, something that I really like. But the blue side is so open and so kind of bright that it really does like kind of take everything from, for certain guitars, crunchy kind of mid-gain overdrive all the way to like treble booster if I've got something really dark, and it has a ton of treble on tap. And then for the green side, change this up a little bit here. I'll tend to run this a little bit hotter and a little bit higher gain. And this is just really nice for kind of big hazy chords. I don't use this nearly as much as I use the blue side. I think it's pretty rare that I'm looking for that kind of amount of scramble and just kind of like kind of fuzzy, complicated harmonics. Definitely a great sound. I think it works a little bit better in clean contexts with single coils. So with the humbuckers, it does kind of get not muddy. Muddy's not the word, but just complicated. But both really, really nice, kind of at both ends of their gain structure. I'm using both of them fairly light. And then kind of the highest of the gain would be the Iron Horse, which comes earlier in the chain, but it sounds like you hope a rat would. yeah, not a ton to say about that other than, it really does kind of what I'm looking for. It's the one distortion pedal I've used that really kind of works on every guitar. And I find my Telecaster's pretty allergic to fuzz. In big muffs, I feel like in that kind of food group of distortion is really, again, kind of guitar dependent for me. But I have a lot of fun. I think the Iron Horse is really an underrated entry, I think, in kind of that rat food group of distortion. But yeah, definitely a favorite. It's been with me the longest of kind of the dirt and foundation that we've kind of explored so far. But yeah, kind of leaving the RJM now, and we'll leave the Lightspeed and the Bloom on for the time being. But kind of headed out, we've got the Vertex Boost, and this is usually hooked up to the volume pedal, and I'm just using that as kind of the volume approach for, kind of keeping the volume out of the audio path. I've had way too many volume pedals break down on me over the years, and so that's been kind of a useful way for me to kind of ensure that we're keeping all of those kind of prone to failure circuits out of the audio path. And actually, it is unplugged at the moment, but this is something that, like, kind of when I am using this on the floor, I do plug in. But because it is an eighth jack as opposed to like a 1/4 inch, I leave it unplugged just to make sure I don't damage the cable and make sure I don't damage the jack. But yeah, I mean, in terms of sound, it really is kind of more of what you've put in. There's definitely it feels like a certain level of glass to it. It sounds really, really good. Not to say it's a totally blank slate, but really kind of just being used as a solo kind of thing, and where I don't want more gain, I just want more guitar. So really simple on that side, and then from there it heads up to the Synesthesia, and this it is tied into MIDI. I don't really have much programmed for it at the moment. I would say this is kind of one of those where delay and reverb has some level of consistency in terms of settings and approaches. I tweak my modulation more than I think anything else. But yeah, kind of why this was put on the board. On kind of one hand, it is one of the most versatile modulation pedals I've used. Obviously, it's got kind of a million modes and uses. But I also just really love the routing. So like you can see, if you're familiar with the pedal, those pluses mean that basically these two sounds are running in parallel at the moment. So if I turn this off, you're hearing just the chorus. Without, and back in. And then I can layer in the vibrato. And that's going to be kind of totally parallel to what you're hearing from the chorus, and that's kind of foundational to a lot of kind of 80s style tones. But then also it's going to be kind of something that just really lets you get pretty inventive, pretty creative, and without like needing to get wild with routing, you're able to kind of drive some really, really diverse sounds. One thing to kind of call out on this side, I don't have anything set up for it at the moment. But the phaser in here is one of my most reached for modes for sure. But if you're like me, you're probably not buying a pedal like this for phasing. and honestly, it was kind of the biggest and most pleasant surprise. The stereo treatment is just unreal. So that's kind of like, you know, how I'm using this. We can layer the chorus back in if we want. And it's got kind of its own approximation of, like, you know, the lo-fi junkie and kind of some of these other, you know, lo-fi modulations now with their kind of V2 update they did a while back. They're good. I don't use them, and the reason I don't use them is because I have the generation loss on the board hooked up in stereo, so everything that I could really need from kind of the lo-fi world is available to me here. And it's kind of, yeah, it's worth noting. Yes, it's missing a knob. I've got it right here. I think the little nut came a little loose, and it happened right as I was kind of getting ready to start shooting this. But if you're not familiar with the generation loss, I did a whole 30-minute stumble through this pedal when it had kind of first come out, and this is something that I had the Cooper V2 for this one, and it really just became kind of a darling of the board. It's one of those sounds that live is not always the most applicable, but especially for kind of the you know, random ambient stuff that I'm posting, as well as excuse me, as well as, you know, some of the kind of studio work that I've done. Really useful for kind of shaping in sounds. I don't touch the saturation, to be honest, but for kind of today and kind of all afternoon, with kind of what we've been experiencing with kind of the tropical storm here in SoCal, I've been rolling with the noise, and that kind of paired with the rain, which you may be able to hear in the background. Actually, it's coming down outside at the moment. Just kind of feels like a, you know, warm blanket of sound. This is one of the things I love the most on the board, and what I really get lost in the most when I'm you know, just kind of exploring sounds. And so kind of in the context of like a bigger ambient sound, it really shines. Without it. So you can really see, you know, how much this is really impacting. After the generation loss, we move on to the Mood Mark II. And I just swapped out my purple guy for the Birthday Cake limited edition, which I am just in love with the pink on for these knobs. But the Mood has been something that has existed in different forms on my board for a very, very long time. It was kind of my entryway into Chase Bliss's sounds, and it really is a favorite of mine. The way that I'm still kind of figuring out how the Mark II kind of plays in this board, if I'm being entirely honest. The way I used the original, I was actually before the volume pedal, and my favorite little trick with the mood was to have the volume pedal down and basically kind of preload the mood with like a little loop or a little sound, and then use the volume pedal to actually swell that in. I suppose you could do some things like that, kind of with like expression, but it is something where it's a little bit different because you can't quite do that silently the way that you could, kind of the way I had it before. But having this in stereo has really kind of made up for kind of that difference for sure. For the most part, we're talking about slip, and we're talking about kind of slip and reverse as kind of my main exploration, I think, so far. The nicest thing I think they did, the two things that I really appreciate what they did with the mood, is that it is not inherently lo-fi anymore. I like being able to affect that with the gen loss and with kind of the other devices I have on board. But the other thing that's really, really incredibly helpful is the fact that I can make wet tones darker. That's a huge deal in terms of making sure they don't get away and don't get too crazy in the process. And so love everything the mood really brings. I think it's all kind of incredible and incredibly practical. If we drop that down. So that's kind of, what's happening in that corner. And people have kind of asked me what order I put these in. The truth is, and I love the fact that they're the same, method of input and output with the TRS stereo, because they flip constantly. So that's the mood and generation loss. People ask me kind of which one comes first, and right now it's the generation loss coming before the mood. But I love that the inputs and outputs are kind of that TRS stereo, because they do flip-flop constantly. So that is kind of really, I think, the paradigm of those two spots is there's always going to be a couple kind of TRS stereo pedals there. I do have kind of the Rev Mode C coming in when those begin to ship. So, I expect to kind of, have a healthy rotation of kind of noise and ambient focused devices kind of rotating through those spots. But generation and mood really do kind of, flip-flop depending on if I want to kind of load lo-fi sound into mood, or if I want to be able to affect on the back end kind of the fidelity and bandwidth of what I've kind of created with mood. It really depends. So there's, back and forth there for sure. In terms of kind of the very back end of the overall board, I feel like kind of the final players deserve no, or not deserve no, but require no introduction. The Hologram Microcosm is kind of next up. And I use this for a ton of things, but really I think the thing that I feel like is the most iconic to this pedal is definitely Mosaic C. I think is kind of like the instantly recognizable sound. And this is tied into MIDI, so we do kind of have clock information being generated by the RJM. This sound and kind of this approach always, it feels like I'm about to play a good arcade game. It is kind of one of my favorite sounds, and one of my favorite sounds to reverse. And so that is something that I do want to kind of tie to a button on the RJM. And that is kind of like one of the bigger things that I really do wish that Hologram had kind of allowed for was putting reverse on a foot switch, like especially like because I'm using MIDI for clock, I don't need to tap in. It'd be really, really nice to be able to reverse on that foot switch. But yeah, I think a couple of favorite modes here. But really, and back to kind of like pedal selection and kind of why I sort of landed on what I have in terms of ambient sounds specifically. There's a lot of boards you've seen over the years with heavy paralleling and heavy, like kind of complicated routing solutions for loopers and delays and stuff like that. And really, I see the merit. I definitely see what people are going for with those approaches. But the biggest thing that kind of is like my pushback is you can load loopers backwards. And really, if I was to load something into Mood and then try to load or freeze something in Microcosm, that wouldn't quite work because the Microcosm would be hearing Mood and all the sound that it's generating. But I can leave this little group of 3 notes frozen in Microcosm, and then if I want to kind of do something completely elsewhere on the neck, I can kind of take to me, that lays really, really well together. I like that it's grouped under the kind of the same reverb in the Big Sky. But that, that's kind of like maybe kind of like the one tip that I have. Like this is really more of an explanation of what I'm doing, more so than really thoughts or recommendations on how to build yours. Like I think this is very much a work in progress, but something I wanted to share. But that is kind of one thing that I would say before you look at parallel mixers, before you look at really complicating the rig, take a step back, look at how you're looping, because I can load something in the timeline and then work backwards to the hologram, backwards to the mood, and I kind of have 3 cohesive separated layers that aren't really a concern in terms of how they're going to play well together. But in terms of kind of creating quick ambient textures, that tends to be my approach. Start at the closest to the end of the chain that you can, and move backwards. And then kind of finally, like the timeline and Big Sky, which is I feel like kind of the ubiquitous pair of MIDI-enabled delay and reverb. It's something they've been with me for a very long time at this point, like 5 or 6 years, I think. And really, for me, what keeps me is not just the sound, but the workflow has kind of yet to be improved on from like a MIDI and laptop tie-in perspective, especially with the strength of the RJM desktop editor and whatnot. Like this was kind of designed to be something that, you know, I could plug into my studio computer and have settings just kind of on tap and be able to edit elegantly without having to get, you know, on your hands and knees and kind of edit knobs and whatnot as much as possible. In terms of the timeline, you know, I'm trying to think if there's like really anything outlandish that I've been using. I definitely have, you know, kind of like a couple of these, like, you know, 3:4 in the dual delay. This is something that if you're not using dual and pattern mode, pattern 1 is a ping pong. This is a little bit different in that, like, basically, like, the delays, kind of the way they're set up here, playing a polyrhythm with that kind of quarter note and dotted eighth, sort of split left and right with this particular delay mode, but it just does so much to create, like, especially for things like swells, some really, really beautiful stereo width. I definitely recommend getting hooked up with that. I leave, if you're, you know, into these pedals, I leave mix and repeats on track so that everything's just easy to edit, but really, really worth working on. And then I've been playing, it's still good. Like, I don't know if we're tired of ice. This is something that, you know, I feel like I was the only person I've ever known. But I feel like it's honestly variations on a theme with the slip. I like it. It feels big and ambient in a way that I really appreciate. And then our lo-fi mode, warm and cuddly. And let me turn the reverb off for a moment. I realize it just feels like a warm blanket. It's one of my favorite sounds. Yeah, and then kind of, you know, I think for the most part, you know, we're kind of now into the stock sounds. I think most of my song-specific stuff is saved in much higher banks to kind of leave room. I've got like kind of a... I never got quite to Andrew from Ambient Endeavors kind of affection for the Strymon analog approximation. That's definitely something that he owns, but I do have kind of a couple, like, I've never used a deluxe memory man, so this is my, like, what I wish they sounded like, or maybe what I wish I sounded like, kind of a setting. But it's just nice, especially for like really, really organic sounds, like really kind of rootsy, kind of folk sounds. Gives you a little bit of a sense of space without, you know, going crazy into the ambient world. But in terms of, like, you know, kind of maxing out the functionality, you know, that's about, you know, kind of where things are at. There's a healthy dose of kind of, you know, D-tape, dotted eighth nonsense going on. I think in my opinion, you buy the timeline for the D-tape and stay for all kind of the other stuff. But that's kind of how I'm using it. If there's anything that you're like, man, it's a waste to own a timeline if you're not doing ... please let me know, because I'm always, I feel like, finding out new things about these pedals. But yeah, well, it feels like at this point, for how long I've had it, it's kind of for life. But you know, definitely a long-term favorite. And then for the Big Sky, for ambient stuff, it's really, I'm sure there are more adventurous people. Cloud is so good. It's incredibly good. It makes a lot of sense to me why they ended up doing Cloudburst as kind of a expansion on the idea, because there's a lot to like and there's a lot to explore. But I've got like pages and pages set up as like, kind of for studio stuff where it needs to be ambient, but you're kind of not sure what setting. I've got kind of a number of different cloud settings that are just kind of like a way for me to quickly kind of flip through and choose like what ambience level, what, kind of what minor settings. Because honestly, I sometimes find that by turning a knob, I don't feel the difference. But if I can change kind of settings and I can change the preset quickly, it's something that like actually kind of really highlights what's happening in terms of differences, where gradual change maybe doesn't get me there the same way. In terms of settings I'm using, I've got kind of a plate. A plate here. That's kind of like, I would say, like my alternative to a spring. I don't really use spring reverb all that much. But these two kind of were made to pair. Nice, simple. It kind of is, it gets me to where I want to be when I just want to hear guitar. Everybody needs a drone sound, and this is always made much better by the generation loss. And then if I can find the preset, we just looked at those clouds and, kind of another cloud preset to nobody's surprise. This setting is the thing I think I've received more questions about over the years than really anything in kind of my guitar playing. And it's my favorite thing the Big Sky does. And it is really, I think I'm going to do like a kind of an in-depth video on just like the things that maybe deserve a second look in the Big Sky if you haven't. And I know I'm totally guilty of this. I really do believe that Timeline and Big Sky users, I would say on the majority, check in on the settings maybe once a year. Like it's like kind of like you get a new guitar and you're like, oh, that reverb is sticking out, or this delay needs to change. That really kind of gets people re-examining. But if you're like me, you don't really look deeper once you find something that works. And that's something that I'm kind of working on shortening the loop on. But this is one of my favorite sounds in the entire thing. The magneto mode, it's essentially kind of like their multi-head thing, and it's so funny to me that it's in the reverb and not the delay. Like this feels way more practical, and I guess it kind of ended up ultimately also kind of resurfacing in the Volante, which I love as well. But this is really cool for production-y stuff to kind of create this kind of interesting percussive. It's a cool, energetic moment to kind of sprinkle into productions, and it's been tucked a few places, but something useful. Kind of one of those pieces that I actually really rarely trot out at this point, but it's in here, and so I thought I'd share it. But then, I guess the last thing that we really never talked through yet is going to be the RJM and how I'm using it in this iteration. And I have some big plans for what I'd like to tie down to MIDI, and I guess beyond that, kind of how I'd like to lay out kind of my performance approach, but then also lay out kind of my programming for things like that I'm doing with Signal Path. And this, kind of the context for this board is this is really the palette that I'm using to surround context around these other pedals. And one of my big things when I'm kind of working with builders to show off designs, I really don't care an incredible amount about how these pedals sound in isolation. I think that's really one thing that's really important to me is if you are watching the channel, I would say there's a 99% chance you have a board of your own. You have a system that you're working within, and it probably just kind of, taking some educated guesses, you probably have a reverb, a delay, an overdrive, a compressor, and you're kind of evaluating the changes, upgrades, additions, all of those kinds of things. And so, I'm always going to show what the pedal sounds like on its own, but that's, not what I want to get stuck on. And I want to talk about, kind of the other things. So this is kind of sort of the backline to the demo stuff that I put together. Personally, I just feel the need to have an ambient rig. Like, that's a big deal to me, to be able to kind of, decompress. I think like a lot of people, music is creativity, but it's also, kind of a human outlet for me. And then also just to have something to take when somebody calls me up needing guitar, whether that be recorded or live. This kind of, with few needs for additions, kind of covers the bases. And so, I think it just kind of feels appropriate to set up some sounds and kind of play it out on kind of some ambience. But if there's anything that like you have kind of questions about, if there's anything you would have done differently, or if there's like kind of something that I missed or got wrong, I think this is definitely a work in progress. I as soon as this was finished, I kind of like immediately started having ideas for what's next. And that's, I imagine, probably a pretty relatable phenomenon if you're into pedal boards. But yeah, this is what I've been doing and what I've been using, and it's been a lot of fun. It feels like home. It's at least starting to. And so, yeah, if you made it this deep in, thank you so much for kind of hanging on for my ramblings. And let me know what you think.